Welcome to Blurr, a place where history, mystery, and human nature quietly unfold. Tonight's episode takes us back to the early years of the 20th century, a time when the world was changing rapidly, yet secrets could still hide behind polite society and quiet streets. In those days, news traveled slower, but when a shocking crime appeared, it captured the attention of entire nations. Our story centers on a case that once dominated newspapers across Europe and America, a case involving a respected doctor, a missing woman, and a trail of suspicion that would cross the Atlantic Ocean. It became one of the most talked about criminal trials of its era, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the strange behavior, unexpected discoveries, and the dramatic pursuit that followed. The events surrounding this case challenged public trust, fascinated investigators, and sparked intense debate about guilt, justice, and the power of new investigative technology that was just beginning to change modern policing. In this episode, we step back into that moment in history to examine the people, the investigation, and the courtroom drama that turned one man into a name the world would never forget. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share with friends, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another chilling story from Blurr. This is the story behind the trial of Dr. Crippen. Chapter 1. A quiet house in London. London, in the early years of the 20th century, was a city of extraordinary contradictions. Its grand avenues and fog-choked alleyways existed side by side, and within its countless terraced houses lived lives that were, on the surface, as orderly and respectable as the city itself demanded. Beneath that surface, of course, was something else entirely. It is from within one of those quiet, respectable lives that one of the most extraordinary criminal cases in British legal history would emerge. A case involving a mild-mannered doctor, a domineering wife, a devoted young woman, and a secret buried young woman, and a secret buried. Beneath the floorboards, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was born in Coldwater, Michigan in 1862. He was a small man in every physical sense, short, slight, and soft-spoken, with a thick mustache and round spectacles that gave him the appearance of a gentle, somewhat distracted academic. He had trained in medicine, though his qualifications were always a subject of some debate, and he had worked in various capacities as a homeopathic physician, a dentist, and an agent for patent medicines. By the time our story begins, he had settled in London, working for a company called Manhunts Remedies, promoting patent cures that were fashionable in that era of medical optimism. His home was at 39 Hilldrop Crescent, in the Holloway district of North London, a pleasant enough Victorian terrace of the kind that stretched in long, curving rows across that part of the city. The house was comfortable and well-furnished, the sort of place that suggested a modest prosperity, and it was here that Dr. Crippen lived with his second wife, Cora, a woman who presented herself to the world under the theatrical name of Belle Elmore. Belle Elmore was everything her husband was not. She was large, loud, and enormously vivacious, a woman who filled every room she entered with her presence. She had ambitions of becoming a music hall star, and though her talent was, by most accounts, modest, her enthusiasm was boundless. She collected friends and admirers the way other women collected jewelry, and she spent money with a freedom that her husband's salary could barely support. She wore furs and diamonds, she threw dinner parties, she laughed too loudly and talked too much. She was, in short, a woman who wanted to be adored. The marriage between Crippen and Belle was, by any reasonable measure, a deeply unhappy one. Those who knew them observed the tension, though Crippen's relentless politeness and Belle's theatrical sociability managed to obscure the worst of it in public. At home, it was a different matter entirely. Belle treated her husband with contempt, belittling him in front of guests, demanding more money than he could provide, and conducting herself with a reckless disregard for his feelings or his dignity. It was in this atmosphere of quiet misery that Dr. Crippen found, or perhaps recognized for the first time, what happiness might actually feel like. Her name was Ethel Leneve. She was his typist and personal assistant, a young woman of 27, pale and slender, with a gentle manner that was, in every way, the opposite of Belle's bluster. Crippen fell profoundly and completely in love with her, and she, it seems, loved him in return. For several years, Crippen and Ethel maintained their relationship while he remained married to Belle. It was a situation that could not last. And in January of 1910, something happened at 39 Hilldrop Crescent that would bring it to the most dramatic and terrible of conclusions. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. On the evening of January 31st, 1910, Dr. and Mrs. Crippen hosted a dinner party at Hilldrop Crescent. Their guests were Paul and Clara Martinetti, fellow members of the Music Hall Ladies' Guild, of which Belle was treasurer. The evening passed pleasantly enough by all accounts. The food was good, the conversation was lively, and the Martinettis departed some time after midnight in good spirit. It was the last time anyone outside that household would ever see Belle Elmore alive. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Crippen offered a series of explanations for his wife's absence. First, he said she had gone to America to visit a sick relative. Then, he told her friends at the Music Hall Ladies' Guild that she had resigned from her position, submitting a letter of resignation that he himself had typed and signed with her name. Then, in March, came a more dramatic announcement. Belle, he said, had died in America from pneumonia. The funeral had already taken place. He told people quietly, devastated. Almost immediately, Ethel Leneve moved into Hilldrop Crescent, and she was seen at public functions wearing Belle's jewelry and Belle's clothes. For people who had known Belle well, this was deeply unsettling. The rapidity of the transition, the casual appropriation of a dead woman's possessions, the complete absence of any verifiable information from America, all of it began to accumulate into something that felt very wrong indeed. Clara Martinetti and her husband were among the first to give voice to their unease. They could not verify a single detail of Crippen's story. There had been no letter from America, no death certificate, no word from any of Belle's relatives. They raised their concerns with other members of the Guild, and eventually, in late June of 1910, those concerns found their way to Scotland Yard. The man assigned to look into the matter was Chief Inspector Walter Dew, a senior detective with considerable experience. He was not, at this stage, treating the matter as a murder inquiry. It was a missing persons case, or perhaps a matter of fraud in connection with the false report of a death. Dew called on Crippen at his office, and then accompanied him to Hilldrop Crescent for an informal look around. Crippen was, by all accounts, entirely cooperative. He showed Dew around the house, answered every question with a kind of weary candor, and eventually confessed that the story of Belle's death was a fabrication. She had not died in America. She had, he now claimed, left him for another man, an American named Bruce Miller, with whom she had been having an affair. He had invented the death story out of shame and embarrassment. He apologized for wasting the inspector's time. Dew was partly satisfied and partly not. He found nothing obviously suspicious at the house, and Crippen's explanation, while embarrassing, was not in itself criminal. He took notes, filed his report, and prepared to make further inquiries. But when he returned to Hilldrop Crescent a few days later, Dr. Crippen and Ethel Leneve were gone. Chapter 3. What the Cellar Held. The disappearance of Crippen and Leneve transformed the investigation entirely. What had been an inquiry into a suspicious story was now a manhunt, and with the manhunt came a far more thorough examination of 39 Hilldrop Crescent. Chief Inspector Dew obtained a warrant and returned to the house with a team of officers. This time they searched systematically and without any particular regard for tidiness. The cellar drew their attention. The brick floor was uneven in places, and Dew noticed that one section appeared to have been disturbed at some point. He ordered his men to dig. What they found beneath those bricks changed everything. Buried in the clay soil of the cellar were human remains, incomplete, deliberately mutilated, and clearly intended never to be found. The remains consisted of portions of a human torso. There were no bones, no head, and no limbs. The flesh had been carefully separated from the skeleton, a process that required both anatomical knowledge and considerable deliberation. Whoever had done this had known exactly what they were doing, and they had taken considerable pains to conceal the identity of their victim, but they had not succeeded entirely. Among the remains, forensic examiners found a piece of skin bearing what appeared to be a surgical scar. It was this scar that would become the central piece of physical evidence in the case against Crippen. Belle Elmore's friends and acquaintances confirmed that she had undergone an abdominal operation some years earlier and bore a distinctive scar on her lower abdomen. The location and character of the scar on the recovered skin were consistent with this. Then came the toxicological findings. The Home Office analyst, Dr. William Wilcox, subjected the remains to a thorough chemical analysis. He found in the tissues the presence of hyoscine hydrobromide, a powerful sedative and narcotic derived from the henbane plant. It was used in carefully measured doses in certain medical procedures. In larger doses, it was a poison capable of causing death. The quantity found was substantial, more than enough to have killed the victim. And the records of a London pharmacist showed that in January of 1910, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen had purchased 5 grains of hyoscine hydrobromide, a quantity far in excess of anything a general practitioner would require for routine medical purposes. The case was now a murder investigation. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Dr. Crippen on a charge of murder, and a separate warrant for Ethel and Eve as an accessory. Their photographs were circulated to ports, railway stations, and police forces across Britain and beyond. The newspapers printed their likenesses on the front page. All of England was looking for them. Chapter 4. Flight across the Atlantic. What Crippen and Ethel Lenevy had done was audacious and, in retrospect, utterly futile, though they could not have known that at the time. They had crossed the English Channel to continental Europe and then made their way to Antwerp, where they boarded the SS Montrose, a Canadian Pacific steamship bound for Quebec. Ethel had cut her hair and dressed as a boy. They traveled under the names Mr. and Master Robinson, a father and his young son. The captain of the Montrose was Henry George Kendall, a sharp-eyed and observant man who took a professional interest in his passengers. He noticed the Robinsons almost immediately. There was something off about them. The boy moved like a girl. The father was attentive to the boy in a way that seemed to go beyond paternal affection. And when Captain Kendall consulted the London newspapers he had brought aboard, he found a photograph of Dr. Crippen that gave him serious pause. Captain Kendall made a decision that would place him permanently in the history books. The Montrose was equipped with Marconi wireless telegraphy, a relatively new technology that allowed ships to communicate with stations on shore. Kendall composed a careful message and transmitted it to the authorities in Britain. He reported that he believed he had Crippen and a female companion disguised as a boy aboard his vessel, and that they were headed for Quebec. This was the first time in history that wireless telegraphy had been used to apprehend a criminal. It was a watershed moment for law enforcement and for the technology itself. The world took notice. Newspapers that were already following the Crippen case with intense interest now had an additional element of drama to report. A high-seas chase conducted through the invisible medium of electromagnetic waves. Chief Inspector Dew moved quickly. He boarded a faster vessel, the SS Laurentic, which by taking a different route could reach the Canadian coast before the Montrose. The chase across the Atlantic was not, in any conventional sense, a chase at all, since the two ships never came within sight of each other, but it gripped the public imagination entirely. People gathered outside newspaper offices waiting for the latest wireless dispatches. The name Crippen was on every lip. On board the Montrose, Crippen was unaware of any of this. He dined with Captain Kendall, chatted pleasantly about the voyage, and appeared by all accounts to be a man at ease. Ethel, maintaining her disguise, was quieter, though she too seemed to believe that they had escaped. Perhaps they allowed themselves, in those strange suspended days at sea, to imagine the life that awaited them in Canada and beyond. On the morning of July 31st, 1910, as the Montrose approached Father Point on the St. Lawrence River, a pilot boat came alongside. Among those on board the pilot boat was Chief Inspector Dew, who had been waiting. He climbed aboard the Montrose, located Crippen on deck, and made himself known. Crippen, according to witnesses, showed no agitation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said quietly that he was glad it was over, that the suspense had been too much to bear. Chapter 5. Return and Remand. Crippen and Ethel Lenevy were returned to England on separate ships. The journey home was covered by the press with an enthusiasm that bordered on the hysterical. Crowds gathered at the docks. Reporters jostled for position. Crippen, small and quiet amid the commotion, was taken directly into custody. Ethel, tearful and clearly distressed, was treated with somewhat more consideration, though she too faced serious charges. Crippen was charged with the willful murder of Cora Crippen, otherwise known as Belle Elmore. Ethel Lenevy was charged as an accessory after the fact, that is, with knowingly assisting a murderer to evade justice. They would be tried separately. Crippen's trial was set for October 1910 at the Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey. For the prosecution, the Crown engaged Richard Muir, one of the most formidable advocates at the English bar. Muir was not a flashy performer. He was methodical, precise, and devastating in cross-examination, the kind of lawyer who won cases not through oratory but through the relentless assembly of facts. He was assisted by Travers Humphreys and S. Ingleby Oddie. For the defense, Crippen retained Arthur Newton, a solicitor who engaged the barrister Alfred Tobin to lead the case in court. Tobin was an experienced advocate, but he faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against his client was circumstantial in parts, but it was also comprehensive, and the public was already convinced of Crippen's guilt long before any jury was sworn. The weeks between Crippen's arrest and his trial were eventful ones in the press. Newspapers published every detail of the case that they could obtain, and a good deal that they embellished or invented. The story had everything that readers of the time could want: a respectable professional man, a flamboyant wife, a tragic love affair, a daring flight, and a dramatic arrest at sea. It was, in the parlance of a later age, a media sensation. Chapter 6. The trial begins. The trial of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen opened on October 18, 1910, before the Lord Chief Justice Lord Alverstone. The court was packed. Every seat in the public gallery had been spoken for days in advance, and those who could not secure admission clustered in the streets outside, waiting for news. It was, by the standards of the day, an event of national significance. Crippen entered the dock looking exactly as he always looked: neat, small, composed, and mild. He wore a dark suit and his familiar round spectacles. He showed no visible emotion as the charge was read out to him, and when asked how he pleaded, he said clearly and without hesitation that he was not guilty. Richard Muir opened for the prosecution with a presentation that was, as was his custom, methodical and thorough. He took the jury through the story from the beginning: the unhappy marriage, the relationship with Ethel Leneve, the disappearance of Belle Elmore, the false reports of her death, the discovery of the remains, the flight and arrest. Each element was presented as part of a coherent narrative leading to a single inescapable conclusion. Muir's central argument was this: Crippen had grown desperate to be free of his wife and free to be with Ethel Leneve. Divorce was possible, but would have been socially and professionally damaging. He had therefore decided to remove the obstacle by other means. He had obtained hyoscine hydrobromide, administered it to Belle in a lethal dose, and then systematically disposed of her body, burying the flesh in the cellar while removing the bones and other identifying features to some other location. The prosecution called a long series of witnesses to support this narrative. Belle's friends testified to the last evening at Hildrop Crescent and to the manner of her disappearance. The pharmacist testified to the purchase of hyoscine. Employees at Crippen's office testified to his relationship with Ethel. Police officers testified to the discovery of the remains and to the circumstances of the arrest. The defense, led by Tobin, listened carefully and took its notes. Its strategy was partly to challenge the identification of the remains as those of Belle Elmore, and partly to suggest that even if a crime had been committed, the evidence against Crippen specifically was insufficient to sustain a conviction. It was not an easy case to make. Chapter 7. The evidence of science. The most significant testimony at the trial came from the scientific witnesses, and among them, none would prove more consequential than a young pathologist named Bernard Spilsbury. He was 33 years old at the time of the Crippen trial, and it was, in a sense, the case that made him. He would go on to become the most celebrated forensic pathologist in British legal history, testifying in hundreds of cases over the following 4 decades. But it was here in this courtroom that his career truly began. Spilsbury testified about the piece of skin recovered from the cellar. He had examined it with great care, and his conclusion was clear and confident. The skin bore a scar that was, in his professional opinion, the result of a surgical operation. It was located and characterized in a way consistent with an abdominal operation of the kind that Belle Elmore's friends confirmed she had undergone. It was not, he asserted firmly, a fold of skin or any other natural feature. It was a surgical scar. The defense called its own experts to challenge this conclusion. Dr. Gilbert Turnbull and others testified that what Spilsbury identified as a scar could equally well be a natural feature of the skin, a fold, or a crease, rather than evidence of any operation. This was a genuine scientific dispute, not merely courtroom theater, and it went to the heart of the identification question. But Spilsbury's manner in the witness box was extraordinarily effective. He was calm, clear, and utterly certain. Where the defense experts hedged and qualified, Spilsbury stated. Where they expressed possibilities, he expressed conclusions. The jury watched and listened, and the impression Spilsbury made was a powerful one. The toxicological evidence was presented by Dr. William Wilcox of the Home Office. He testified that he had found hyoscine hydrobromide in the tissues recovered from the cellar, in a quantity of approximately 2/7 of a grain. This was a significant amount, easily sufficient to cause death in an adult, and consistent with the dose that might be administered to render a person unconscious before killing them by other means. The combination of the hyoscine and the remains and the purchase of hyoscine by Crippen in January was, the prosecution argued, not coincidental. Crippen had bought the poison. His wife had died of the poison. He had buried her body in his cellar. The chain of inference was short, and each link was solid. The defense pointed out correctly that the evidence was circumstantial. There was no witness to the murder. There was no confession. There was no direct evidence that Crippen had administered the hyoscine to Bell. All of it was inference, however compelling that inference might appear. Chapter 8. Crippen takes the stand. One of the most significant decisions made during the trial was the decision to put Crippen in the witness box. Under the Criminal Evidence Act of 1898, a defendant could choose to give evidence on his own behalf, though he could not be compelled to do so. If he chose to testify, he became subject to cross-examination. It was a double-edged sword, and many defense lawyers counseled against it. But Crippen agreed to take the stand. His evidence in chief was delivered calmly. He maintained, as he had always maintained, that Bell had left him voluntarily. He had not killed her. He had no idea whose remains were in the cellar. He supposed, he said with some sadness, that they might have been there before he and Bell moved into the house. The hyoscine he had purchased had been for use in his medical practice, though he admitted he could produce no records of it, having been dispensed to patients. Then Richard Muir rose to cross-examine. What followed was one of the most celebrated pieces of courtroom advocacy in English legal history. Muir was relentless, precise, and merciless, though never theatrical. He took Crippen's story apart piece by piece, question by patient question. If Bell had left voluntarily, Muir asked, why had Crippen told her friends she was dead? Crippen said he wanted to protect her reputation. But why had he told them she had died of pneumonia, a specific illness, in a specific country, at a specific time, if he did not know where she was? Crippen had no satisfactory answer. If Bell was alive somewhere, why had she not contacted her friends, her colleagues, or her guild? Crippen said he did not know. Why had no record of any woman matching Bell's description departed England for America in January 1910? Crippen could not explain that either. What had he done with the 5 grains of hyoscine he had purchased? He had used them for patients. Could he name a single patient to whom he had administered hyoscine? He could not. Could he produce a single record? He could not. Muir pressed on. Why had he fled when Dew came back to question him? Because Crippen said he had panicked. But he was an innocent man, Muir noted. Why does an innocent man panic and run? Crippen's composure held remarkably well throughout this sustained assault, but the substance of his answers was weak. He could explain nothing satisfactorily. He could corroborate nothing. His account of events required the jury to accept a series of coincidences so improbable that credulity buckled under the weight of them. The cross-examination lasted for hours, and when it ended, many observers felt that whatever slim chance the defense had possessed before it began had now been extinguished entirely. Chapter 9. Closing arguments and verdict. The closing speeches in the Crippen trial were, on both sides, substantial efforts. For the defense, Tobin argued with considerable skill that the evidence, while suggestive, did not reach the standard required for a criminal conviction. The remains had not been conclusively identified as those of Belle Elmore. The presence of hyoscine was consistent with other explanations. The flight to Canada was the act of a frightened man, not necessarily a guilty one. Muir's closing address for the prosecution was, in its way, a masterpiece of quiet persuasion. He did not harangue the jury. He did not appeal to their emotions, at least not directly. He simply walked them through the evidence again, point by careful point, and asked them to consider what other explanation could account for all of it. Belle Elmore had vanished. Human remains had been found in Crippen's cellar. Those remains contained a poison that Crippen had purchased. Crippen had told a series of increasingly elaborate lies about his wife's whereabouts. He had fled when questioned. All of it pointed in one direction. Lord Alverstone summed up the case with considerable care, directing the jury's attention to the key points of evidence and reminding them of the legal standard they were required to apply. They must be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt. They must not convict on suspicion alone, but if the evidence taken as a whole excluded every reasonable hypothesis of innocence, then they were entitled, and indeed obliged, to return a verdict of guilty. The jury retired at 2:30 in the afternoon. They returned at 27 minutes. In a case of this complexity and consequence, it was a remarkably short deliberation, and it spoke clearly to the weight of the evidence as the jury had assessed it. The foreman rose and delivered the verdict. Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen was guilty of the willful murder of Cora Crippen. The courtroom stirred. Lord Alverstone asked Crippen whether he had anything to say before sentence was passed. Crippen replied quietly and without drama that he was innocent of the charge, and that he had nothing further to add. The Lord Chief Justice then donned the black cap, the traditional garment worn by English judges when imposing the death sentence, and sentenced Crippen to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. Chapter 10. The Trial of Ethel Leneve. Ethel Leneve's trial took place shortly after Crippen's conviction. She faced the charge of being an accessory after the fact to the murder of Belle Elmore. The central question was whether Ethel had known at the time she fled with Crippen that he had committed a murder. If she had known and had assisted his escape, she was guilty. If she had acted in ignorance, following the man she loved without understanding the full nature of what he had done, she was not. Her defense was led by F.E. Smith, one of the most brilliant advocates of his generation, a man of dazzling rhetorical gifts and sharp legal intelligence. Smith painted Ethel as a naive and trusting young woman who had been deceived by a man she adored. She had not known about the murder. She had believed Crippen's account of Belle's departure and subsequent death. When he suggested they flee to Canada, she had gone with him because she loved him and trusted him, not because she understood she was helping a killer escape justice. The prosecution argued that Ethel's conduct implied knowledge. She had worn Belle's jewelry and clothes. She had moved into Hilldrop Crescent within weeks of Belle's disappearance. She had disguised herself to flee the country. These were not the actions of a woman who was simply in love. They were the actions of a woman who knew, but the jury was not persuaded. After a brief deliberation, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Ethel Leneve walked free from the Old Bailey. She was 27 years old, and her life, whatever was left of it, was her own again. The verdict was not entirely surprising. The evidence against Ethel was genuinely ambiguous. A woman in love with a man who tells her his wife has left and then died. A woman who accepts gifts from that man and moves in with him may be guilty of poor judgment and moral blindness, without being guilty of any crime. The jury gave her the benefit of the doubt, and the law required them to do so. Chapter 11. The Appeal and the Scaffold. Crippen's lawyers appealed his conviction to the Court of Criminal Appeal. They argued on several grounds, contesting the admissibility of certain evidence, the adequacy of the summing up, and the sufficiency of the evidence to support a conviction. The appeal was heard by 3 judges and dismissed in its entirety. The conviction stood. A petition was submitted to the Home Secretary seeking a commutation of the death sentence. It gathered a modest number of signatures from people who believed, for various reasons, that Crippen had not had a fair trial, or that the evidence was insufficient, or simply that execution was too severe a penalty in the circumstances. The Home Secretary considered the petition and declined to interfere with the sentence. During the weeks between his conviction and his execution, Crippen spent his time in the condemned cell at Pentonville Prison writing letters. Many of those letters were to Ethel Leneve. They are among the most extraordinary documents connected with the case, suffused with a quiet and tender devotion that contrasts jarringly with the violent act for which he had been convicted. Whether they reveal the authentic inner life of an innocent man or the emotional landscape of a man capable of murder is a question that each reader must answer for themselves. On the morning of November 23, 1910, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was led from his cell to the scaffold at Pentonville Prison. He was hanged by John Ellis, the public executioner. He was 48 years old. According to those present, he died without drama, as he had lived quietly and without a word that anyone thought worth recording. Among the personal effects found in his cell was a photograph of Ethel Lenique. It had been with him throughout his imprisonment. He had asked that it be buried with him, and that request was honored. Chapter 12. What science said then and now. The Crippen case was regarded in its time as a triumph of forensic science. The identification of the remains through the surgical scar, the detection of hyoscine in the tissues, and the careful chain of evidence assembled by Spilsbury, Wilcox, and their colleagues represented the state-of-the-art in forensic investigation. The case became a landmark in the development of forensic pathology as a discipline and helped to establish the credibility of expert scientific testimony in criminal proceedings. For nearly a century, the conviction was accepted as secure, the evidence solid, and the verdict just. Then, in 2007, a team of researchers led by Dr. David Foran of Michigan State University published findings that challenged the foundation of the case. They had obtained samples of the remains preserved from the original investigation and subjected them to mitochondrial DNA analysis, a technique that was, of course, entirely unknown in 1910. Their conclusion was startling. The DNA extracted from the remains did not match the DNA profile of individuals known to be descendants of Belle Elmore's maternal line. Furthermore, the researchers argued, the remains appeared to be those of a male, not a female. If these findings were correct, they suggested that the body in the cellar at Hilldrop Crescent was not Belle Elmore at all, and that the entire basis of the prosecution's case against Crippen had rested on a mistaken identification. The response from the forensic and legal communities was not uniformly enthusiastic. Critics pointed out that mitochondrial DNA analysis of century-old tissue samples is subject to significant technical challenges, including contamination and degradation that can produce unreliable results. The chain of custody of the samples was questioned. The identification of the remains as male was disputed by other experts who reviewed the original evidence. The debate has not been definitively resolved. The 2007 findings are not universally accepted by specialists in the field, and the evidence on which Crippen was convicted, while now subject to question, has not been comprehensively overturned. The question of whether he was guilty remains for some genuinely open. Chapter 13. The legacy of the case. The Crippen case left marks on British legal and cultural history that are still visible today. In the immediate term, it demonstrated the potential of wireless telegraphy in law enforcement with a vividness that no theoretical argument could have matched. The Marconi Company, which had been promoting wireless communication for commercial and maritime purposes, found itself the beneficiary of an extraordinary piece of advertising. The technology spread rapidly in the years that followed. The case also established Bernard Spilsbury as the dominant figure in British forensic pathology for the next 3.5 decades. He testified in virtually every major murder case in England from the Crippen trial until his retirement in the 1940s. His authority in the witness box became so absolute, and juries' deference to his opinions so complete, that later commentators would question whether his involvement in cases effectively predetermined their outcome. Some legal historians have argued that Spilsbury's certainty, which was one of his greatest assets in court, was also one of his greatest liabilities as a scientist, since science requires openness to doubt that Spilsbury sometimes seemed to lack. The case prompted reflection on the relationship between press coverage and the fairness of criminal trials. The saturation coverage of the Crippen case, from the discovery of the remains through the arrest and into the trial itself, meant that almost every juror in England could claim some prior knowledge of the case. The question of whether a fair trial was possible in such circumstances was one that lawyers and judges would grapple with in subsequent cases, and it remains a live question wherever media coverage of criminal proceedings is intense. For Captain Kendall, The arrest of Crippen brought fame and a certain prosperity. He wrote about the episode, gave interviews, and was celebrated as the man whose quick thinking and use of the new wireless technology had brought a murderer to justice. He continued his career at sea for many years afterward. Chapter 14. Ethel Leneve, after the trial. Following her acquittal, Ethel Leneve disappeared, quite deliberately, from public life. She left England, changed her name, and built what she hoped would be an anonymous existence. She eventually settled in suburban South London under a different identity, married a man named Smith, had children, and lived quietly for the rest of her life. She gave one major interview to a newspaper shortly after her acquittal, and in it she insisted on her innocence and on the depth of her love for Crippen. She maintained that she had believed his account of Bell's departure and death, that she had had no knowledge of any crime, and that she had followed him to Canada because she loved him and could see no other choice. Whether this was the complete truth, a partial truth, or a carefully constructed story, it is impossible now to say with any certainty. Her identity was apparently discovered by a newspaper in the 1950s, and the discovery must have been a terrible shock, to have the past reach into the quiet life she had constructed and remind the world of who she had once been. She died in 1967, at the age of 84, having outlived the events at Hildreth Crescent by more than half a century. What Ethel Leneve knew, and when she knew it, will remain among the permanent uncertainties of this case. What is clear is that she loved Crippen, that she suffered greatly for that love, and that she spent the rest of her life attempting, with partial success, to escape the shadow of it. It is worth pausing, at this point in our account, to consider the human beings at the center of this story, not as actors in a legal drama or exhibits in a forensic inquiry, but simply as people whose lives intersected with dreadful consequences. Belle Elmore was, in many respects, not a sympathetic figure. She was domineering, extravagant, self-absorbed, and often unkind to the man she had married. But she was also a woman of enormous vitality, someone who wanted to be somebody in a world that offered women very few routes to significance. Her ambition in the music hall, however outsized it may have appeared relative to her actual talent, was a form of assertion, a refusal to be merely a doctor's wife in a Victorian terrace. She deserved better than what happened to her, whatever precisely that was. Crippen himself is perhaps the strangest figure in the case. Everything we know about him, apart from the crime for which he was convicted, suggests a man of gentleness, courtesy, and genuine emotional depth. The letters he wrote to Ethel from prison are not the letters of a cold-blooded poisoner. They are the letters of a man who loved, who suffered, and who faced his death with a quiet dignity that many found more affecting than they expected. Whether that gentleness coexisted with the capacity for murder, or whether it spoke to an innocence that the evidence failed to establish, is something that the historical record cannot resolve. Ethel Leneve was, in the end, the survivor. She carried the weight of the story with her for the rest of a long life, attempting to bury it beneath the ordinary accumulation of years and experience. That she largely succeeded is, perhaps, a testament to human resilience. That she could never entirely succeed is, perhaps, a testament to the peculiar persistence of a story like this one. Chapter 16. Reasonable doubt and its discontents. One of the persistent questions raised by the Crippen case is whether the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt was actually met. The evidence against Crippen was circumstantial. There was no eyewitness to the crime. There was no confession. The identification of the remains depended on expert opinion that was, even at the time, contested, and has since been challenged on more fundamental grounds. In cases built on circumstantial evidence, the question is whether the evidence excludes every reasonable explanation other than guilt. The prosecution argued that it did. The defense argued that it did not. The jury, after 27 minutes, sided with the prosecution. But were there reasonable alternative explanations? Crippen's own account, that Bell had left voluntarily and that he had fabricated the death story out of embarrassment, was not inherently impossible. His purchase of hyoscine could, in principle, have had a legitimate medical explanation that he simply failed to document properly. The remains in the cellar could, in principle, have been deposited there by a previous occupant. Each of these alternative explanations taken individually was possible. Taken together, the prosecution argued they strained credibility beyond breaking point. The 2007 DNA findings, if accepted, would suggest that the most fundamental element of the prosecution's case, the identification of the remains as Belle Elmore, was wrong. If the body in the cellar was not Belle, then the entire edifice constructed around it collapses. Where was Belle? We do not know. These are deeply uncomfortable questions for anyone who regards the verdict in the Crippen case as secure. Chapter 17. The Edwardian Context. To fully understand the Crippen case, it helps to understand the world in which it occurred. Edwardian England was a society caught between the certainties of the Victorian era and the upheavals that were approaching, though few could see them clearly yet. The music hall in which Belle Elmore aspired to shine was a characteristically Edwardian institution, a form of entertainment that blurred class boundaries and gave women an unusual degree of public visibility, while simultaneously demanding that they perform within a very particular and constraining set of expectations. Marriage in Edwardian England was a legal and social institution of great rigidity. Divorce was possible but expensive, socially catastrophic, and professionally damaging, particularly for men in respectable occupations. A doctor who divorced his wife would find his social standing severely compromised and his practice potentially destroyed. This context is essential to understanding the pressures that bore on Crippen, whether those pressures ultimately drove him to murder or to some other desperate response. The role of the newspapers in the Crippen case also reflects a distinctly Edwardian phenomenon. The popular press had expanded enormously in the preceding 2 decades, and crime reporting had become one of its primary attractions. The Crippen case offered every element that newspaper readers of the era found compelling: domestic drama, hidden vice, exotic forensic detail, a chase at sea, and the inexorable machinery of justice. It was a story ideally suited to the media of its time. The emergence of forensic science as a credible and important element of criminal investigation was also very much an Edwardian development. Fingerprinting had been introduced to Scotland Yard in 1901. Forensic toxicology was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The deployment of these tools in the Crippen case was part of a broader transformation in the way that criminal investigations were conducted and criminal trials were argued. Chapter 18. Lessons from the courtroom. The Crippen trial has been studied by lawyers, historians, and criminologists for more than a century, and its lessons remain instructive. One of the most important concerns the role of expert testimony in criminal proceeding. The central factual dispute in the case, whether the skin from the cellar bore a surgical scar or a natural fold, was resolved by the jury on the basis of competing expert opinions. They chose to accept Spilsbury's opinion in part because of the manner in which it was delivered. This raises a fundamental question about the capacity of lay juries to evaluate expert scientific testimony. When 2 qualified experts disagree about a matter that requires specialized knowledge to assess, how is a jury of ordinary men and women, however conscientious, supposed to determine which expert is correct? In the Crippen case, the jury appears to have been influenced significantly by Spilsbury's manner and authority as much as by the scientific content of his evidence. This is a problem that has not gone away. A second lesson concerns the dangers of pre-trial publicity. By the time the Crippen jury was sworn, every juror in England had been exposed to extensive newspaper coverage that presented Crippen as almost certainly guilty. The law of contempt of court was intended to prevent precisely this kind of prejudicial coverage, but its enforcement in 1910 was far less rigorous than it would later become. Whether the jury was genuinely able to put aside what they had read and heard outside the courtroom is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. A third lesson concerns the irreversibility of capital punishment. Crippen was executed. If the 2007 DNA findings are correct and he was innocent, there is nothing that can be done. The finality of execution is its most troubling feature, not because it is disproportionate in cases of genuine guilt, but because no system of justice operated by fallible human beings can guarantee that it will only be applied to the genuinely liable. Guilty. Chapter 19. The mystery that remains. If we set aside for a moment the question of Crippen's guilt or innocence, another mystery presents itself. What happened to Belle Elmore? She was a real person, a woman of strong personality and considerable presence, who was known to dozens of people in London's music hall world. After January 31st, 1910, she was never seen or heard from again. If Crippen killed her, the question answers itself, though it raises the subsidiary question of what he did with the parts of the body that were never found. The bones, the head, and the limbs were never recovered. They could have been destroyed, disposed of in the river, or buried in some other location. This is consistent with the theory of guilt. If the DNA evidence is correct, and the body in the cellar was not Belle, then she disappeared and was never found for some other reason. Perhaps she did go to America. Perhaps she died there, unknown and unidentified. Perhaps she lived out her life under a different name, as Ethel Lenevy did, deliberately cutting ties with the life she had known. These are possibilities, not answers. The case of Belle Elmore is, from one angle, simply the case of a missing woman who has never been found, a phenomenon that is, tragically, not uncommon. What makes it unusual is the extraordinary legal and historical superstructure that has been built around it, a superstructure within which a man was convicted, sentenced, and executed. The questions that remain unanswered are not merely matters of historical curiosity. They touch on the most fundamental concerns of any criminal justice system. Did we get it right? Did we convict the guilty man? Did we protect the innocent? When we cannot answer those questions with confidence, the discomfort they generate is not merely intellectual. It is moral. Chapter 20. A story that will not rest. More than a century after the events at Hilldrop Crescent, the Crippen case continues to attract attention. Books have been written about it, plays have been staged, television documentaries have been made, and academic papers continue to appear in forensic and legal journals. The case has a grip on the imagination that most criminal cases, however notorious, eventually lose. Part of its appeal is the sheer richness of its constituent elements. There is the domestic tragedy of the unhappy marriage. There's the quiet love affair that may or may not have had murder as its consequence. There's the forensic puzzle of the cellar, the battle of experts over a piece of skin. There is the spectacular chase across the Atlantic, with its innovative use of wireless technology. There's the trial itself, with its clash of formidable advocates. And there is, beneath all of it, the persistent uncertainty that refuses to resolve. The house at 39 Hilldrop Crescent no longer exists. It was demolished long ago, replaced by a block of flats that stands on the site without any particular acknowledgement of what occurred there. The Holloway district has changed enormously since 1910. The fog has lifted, the gas lamps have gone, the terraces have been rebuilt and remodeled. But the story endures. It endures partly because it is, in purely dramatic terms, a great story, one that contains love, betrayal, violence, science, law, and the sea. It endures partly because the characters involved are genuinely interesting, more complex and more human than the cardboard figures that populate most crime narratives. And it endures partly because it has never quite been settled. Was Crippen guilty? The jury said yes. The law said yes. History has largely said yes. But history does not always have the last word. Sometimes a case that seemed closed opens again, not because the original verdict was necessarily wrong, but because the passage of time and the development of new knowledge reveal that the original question was harder than it appeared. The trial of Dr. Crippen was, in its time, a triumph of the investigative and judicial systems of Edwardian Britain. It was also, viewed from a sufficient distance, a reminder that those systems, like all human systems, operate within the bounds of what is known and what can be known, and that those bounds are always narrower than we might like. In November of 1910, a small, gentle, mild-mannered man was led to a scaffold in Pentonville Prison and hanged for a murder that he denied, with apparent sincerity, to his last breath. Whether he was guilty or innocent, his death ended one chapter of the story. But it did not end the story itself. The story of Dr. Crippen, of Belle Elmore, and of Ethel Lenevy is, at its heart, a story about the things we do in the name of love, the things we do in the name of justice, and the painful, irreducible gap that sometimes opens between the two. It is a story that still, more than 100 years after those long-ago events, refuses to let us go. Thank you for listening.